In the intricate web of 20th century crime, few figures have achieved the notoriety of Charles "Lucky" Luciano, the criminal genius who reorganized the American Mafia into a streamlined corporate syndicate. But behind the usual catalogue of murders, rackets, and backroom power struggles lies a chapter that remains curiously tender: the story of Igea Lissoni. She was, as Luciano would later confess with rare sincerity, the only woman I ever loved in my whole life. Her story deserves to stand on its own, and yet, like so many women linked to notorious men, she has been historically eclipsed, a footnote in someone else's legend. This is the story of Igea Lissoni, a Milanese woman of grace, contradictions, fierce loyalty, and ultimately, tragic fate. Igea Lissoni was born on December 28, 1920, into a respectable middle-class family in Milan, Italy's financial and cultural nerve center. The Lissonis lived comfortably, if not lavishly. They embodied the values of northern Italian society: dignity, education, and a healthy concern for appearances. Her father, Giovanni Lissoni, was by all accounts a solid bourgeois patriarch. Her mother, Ida, stern and conventional. It was into this orderly world that Igea arrived, bringing with her both charm and, as it would turn out, a flair for disrupting expectations. Even as a child, Igea displayed an appetite for beauty, movement, and attention. Her parents, noting her early passion for dance, enrolled her at Milan's most prestigious ballet academy, La Scala. There, under the high-vaulted ceilings where Toscanini had once conducted and Callas would later sing, she trained among the disciplined daughters of the Milanese elite. Ballet, with its merciless standards and ruthless hierarchy, does not easily yield stardom to even the most ambitious. Igea was talented, certainly, but she was self-aware. Years later, she would recall with characteristic bluntness, "I realized I could never become a prima ballerina. I didn't have enough talent. So I began to dance in nightclubs, hoping someday I might dance in films and perhaps become a star." The decision scandalized her family. Trading the marble dignity of La Scala for the velvet shadows of Milanese cabarets was hardly what her parents had envisioned. Yet, in this move, one sees the essential Igea: practical, adaptable, but always determined to claim a place on her own terms. She discovered something in nightclubs that the opera house could never provide: autonomy, attention, and a paying audience that adored her. In later years, when the press inevitably sought a romantic origin story for her relationship with Luciano, Igea offered up a pleasing fiction. She claimed that a Milanese fortune-teller had once prophesied she would meet the man of her dreams on Capri, that enchanted island in the Bay of Naples where Roman emperors once frolicked. She went, she said, and there, in the grand suite of the Quisisana Hotel, fate delivered Lucky Luciano into her life. It was a fine story. It sounded exotic, magical, and conveniently spared both parties the more prosaic truth. They had, in fact, first crossed paths not under the Mediterranean sun, but at a dinner party in Milan in early 1948. Destiny, in this version, was less picturesque and more like well-connected socializing. Luciano, newly exiled to Italy after his deportation from the United States, was circulating among polite company, trying to reinvent himself, or at least appear respectable enough for Italian authorities. It was there, among Milan's wealthy and sophisticated, that the hardened mob boss encountered something utterly unfamiliar to him: a woman who was unimpressed. Luciano was 50 years old when he first set eyes on Igea. She was 26. The age difference hardly fazed either party. What made their dynamic unusual was the cultural chasm between them. Milanese to her bones, Igea embodied northern Italian refinement, fashionably elegant, highly educated, and deeply skeptical of Sicilian machismo. For a woman raised to respect decorum, Luciano represented everything one ought to avoid. He was, after all, the world's most famous gangster, a Sicilian exile who had traded the back streets of Manhattan for reluctant exile on Italian soil. Luciano, for his part, was disarmed. Used to fawning attention, he was unprepared for Igea's immediate coolness. When she recognized him at the dinner party, or rather, recognized the notorious figure she had seen in newspapers, she said nothing. She simply turned and walked away. In most cases, this would have been the end of the story. Lucky Luciano was not accustomed to chasing anyone, but something about Igea's indifference fascinated him. For perhaps the first time in his life, the predator found himself on uncertain footing. "I never had no trouble meeting broads before," he would later say in his uniquely mangled grammar, "so I didn't have no idea I was going to have trouble with her." He arranged through mutual acquaintances to see her again, this time at a nightclub performance in Rome where she was dancing. There, emboldened, he made his first direct approach, inviting her to dinner. She refused. Rebuffed, but not discouraged, Luciano shifted tactics. This was no casual conquest, no quick nightclub fling. For reasons he could scarcely articulate, or perhaps dared not admit even to himself, Luciano became smitten. He sent flowers. He sent gifts. He arranged for mutual friends, including the singer Loretta Masiero, to gently lobby on his behalf. Still, Igea resisted. Her reluctance was genuine. She was not naive. She knew exactly who Luciano was. And while she could not ignore the intense charisma that surrounded him like perfume, she also saw the scandal, the notoriety, and the danger. A Milanese woman consorting with a Sicilian gangster. The very thought would scandalize her father. And yet, behind Igea's composure, something was shifting. She was pragmatic enough to recognize her own feelings. For Luciano, this relationship marked a radical departure from his previous existence. As he later told Martin Gosch in his extensive interviews, "All my life until then, I never needed nobody. It was always easy come, easy go. After a few weeks of Igea playing hard to get, something that never happened to me before, I found I was thinking about her all the time." It was not merely sexual attraction, though that was certainly present. Luciano discovered with Igea something profoundly unsettling for a man who had built his life upon power, control, and emotional detachment: vulnerability. "None of the other broads meant nothing to me. I don't pretend to know what love is. But when I started thinking about her all day long, Igea Lissoni was not for one night." His devotion deepened quickly. She was no mere mistress in the European tradition, but something closer to a common law wife. They exchanged rings, if not formal vows. She moved permanently into his home, and together they attempted something approaching domesticity, though naturally in Luciano's world, domesticity came with its peculiar complications. When it became clear that their relationship was no passing affair, Igea decided, with typical directness, to introduce Luciano to her family. She preferred her parents learn of the situation from her, rather than read about it in the scandal sheets. Together, they traveled north to Milan, where Luciano was presented to the Lissonis. The meeting went approximately as one might expect. Her father, Giovanni, was aghast. His daughter, a cultivated Milanese woman, had taken up not merely with a foreigner, but with the most infamous gangster in the world. An American killer, as her father reportedly called him. It was, by bourgeois standards, incomprehensible. And yet, time has a curious way of smoothing sharp edges. Over the years that followed, as the relationship endured, the Lissoni family slowly reconciled themselves to Igea's choice. By the mid-1950s, Luciano was welcomed, cautiously but without hostility, as something resembling a proper son-in-law. Scandal had slowly transmuted into reluctant acceptance. For a brief interlude of roughly a year, life with Igea allowed Luciano to experience something resembling normalcy. They traveled widely through Italy, weekends on Capri at the fabled Hotel Quisisana, visits to the Sicilian resort of Taormina, extended stays at Palermo's opulent Villa Igea, a hotel whose very name, by happy coincidence, mirrored hers. During these years, Luciano was seen, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, smiling freely in public. The old tension and paranoia that marked his New York years seemed, if not absent, at least diminished. His business dealings, while still opaque, had shifted focus. He was trying, awkwardly, to appear legitimate. Of course, complete legitimacy was always something of an illusion for a man like Luciano. But within the confines of his exile, Igea offered him not only companionship, but stability. Throughout their years together, Igea occasionally expressed a desire for children. But Luciano, haunted by his past, refused. "I didn't want no son of mine to go through life as the son of Luciano, the gangster," he explained. "That'd be sentencing the kid to a life of misery before he was born." It was, perhaps, one of the few genuinely selfless decisions Luciano ever made, and to her credit, Igea understood. As with so many other points of friction between them, they found compromise in mutual respect, if not always perfect happiness. Of course, no happy interlude lasts forever, particularly for men like Luciano. As their romance blossomed, law enforcement agencies on both sides of the Atlantic continued to monitor his every move. Rumors of narcotics trafficking, black market operations, and underworld connections swirled perpetually around him. By early 1949, a major narcotics bust in New York threatened to ensnare him once again. Though never directly implicated, Luciano found himself under renewed suspicion. In Rome, Italian authorities, under pressure from their American counterparts, arrested him briefly, holding him for questioning. Throughout his brief incarceration, Igea played the role of the dutiful Italian wife with dignified ferocity. She camped outside the prison gates, pleaded with officials, and publicly decried what she called the persecution of her beloved Charlie. Her devotion did not go unnoticed. Even hardened officials conceded that her behavior was that of a proper wife. This storm marked the beginning of a far darker phase of their shared life, one where external forces would conspire to strip away their carefully constructed sanctuary. By late 1949, the Italian government, weary of Lucky Luciano's lingering presence in Rome and sensitive to American pressure, issued a simple decree: leave Rome. Whether or not the authorities could prove any actual criminal activity was beside the point. Luciano was deemed undesirable, and the polite fiction of his voluntary residence in the capital was now terminated. Thus began his forced relocation southward. It was Igea, ever the practical mind behind Luciano's chaotic life, who guided their next steps. After a brief and uncomfortable period in Sicily, a place Luciano had little nostalgia for despite his birthplace in Lercara Friddi, they settled on Naples. The decision was both strategic and deeply personal. Naples offered sufficient distance from the scrutiny of Rome and New York, but also a cosmopolitan charm that allowed Igea to maintain the kind of elegant, urban lifestyle she had always cherished. Naples also came with another advantage: anonymity, at least for a time. While Luciano was notorious in America and among international law enforcement, he was not a household name for most ordinary Neapolitans. In this chaotic, vibrant port city, he could finally attempt the thing he had never truly known: a quiet, domestic existence. They took up residence in a grand penthouse apartment at Via Tasso 464, perched halfway up the hillside overlooking the Bay of Naples, with sweeping views toward Mount Vesuvius. Luciano had originally bought the entire apartment block, but eventually sold off all units except the penthouse, which became their sanctuary. Their apartment was not merely comfortable. It was a small palace, tastefully furnished by Igea, who imported many of her belongings from storage in Rome. Here, behind heavy doors, Igea set about transforming Lucky Luciano into something approximating a respectable gentleman. And to some extent she succeeded, an accomplishment for which history has rarely given her sufficient credit. In public, Luciano projected the air of the cosmopolitan exile, well-dressed, impeccably groomed, dining at Naples' finest restaurants, and often accompanied by Igea, who cut a striking figure wherever she appeared. The pair were fixtures at the city's best cafes and racecourses, often lingering for hours over dinner, wine, and conversations that rarely touched upon Luciano's old life. But behind closed doors, Igea's influence was far more profound. She insisted he maintain certain standards: no crude language at home, no violent outbursts, no displays of the brutal temper that had once served him so effectively in the streets of New York. Under her gentle but firm guidance, Luciano adopted a version of domestic discipline. He read, or at least pretended to, the classics she selected. He developed a fondness for Shakespeare, an irony not lost on those who knew his earlier limitations in literacy. She broadened his cultural horizons, surrounding him with books and art. For a man whose empire had once been built on vice, violence, and blackmail, this intellectual reinvention was almost absurd. And yet, it was genuine, because it was for her. Even their pets reflected this unlikely bourgeois life. Igea acquired 2 small dogs, including a miniature pinscher she named Bambi after the Walt Disney film. The sight of lucky Luciano, mob boss extraordinaire, doting over a tiny dog, was the sort of thing no American gangster would have believed possible. Yet in Naples, under Igea's rule, it became routine. Of course, Luciano could not entirely suppress his instincts. As much as Igea urged him toward a legitimate life, and as much as he vowed to comply, financial pressures remained, particularly as his American sources of income gradually dried up. At first, he attempted poultry farming outside Santa Marinella, an enterprise so out of character that one suspects even Luciano himself saw the humor in it. Unsurprisingly, it floundered. Livestock management was not in his skill set. Next came the more ambitious venture, an appliance store in Naples. Here, at least, he applied the kind of entrepreneurial savvy that had once made him a genius of the underworld. Luciano offered installment payment plans, a radical innovation in post-war Italy, where consumer credit was virtually unheard of. His shop sold German and Italian-made washers, refrigerators, toasters, and irons, small luxuries for a population still clawing its way out of wartime poverty. For a while, business was surprisingly good, but the influx of cheap American imports eventually eroded his niche, and the store slipped into the red. Ever the pragmatist, Luciano closed the venture after accumulating roughly $50,000 in unpaid debts. The irony was not lost on him. In his former life, such debts would have been collected by more persuasive means. Indeed, for old time's sake, and with Igea's reluctant consent, he called in a distant cousin, Momo Salemi, to assist with some discreet collections. Still, these were minor indulgences compared to the grand criminal enterprises of his youth. Under Igea's influence, Luciano largely avoided returning to serious crime, not out of fear, but because he genuinely wished to please her. She had become, in many ways, his moral center. Despite the cultivated domestic tranquility that Igea built around Luciano, one should not be tempted to romanticize their life as entirely peaceful. Love, even deep love, is rarely simple, especially when one of the participants is lucky Luciano. The simple truth was this: Luciano, for all his devotion to Igea, remained a man conditioned by decades of indulgence and entitlement. Old habits, particularly where women were concerned, die hard. Though he referred to Igea as his wife, though he acknowledged her as the only woman I ever loved, and though they built their home and life together with remarkable tenderness, Luciano's eyes still wandered. The Neapolitan nightlife was vibrant, and Luciano was, by nature, a creature of nightclubs and social circles. In moments when Igea was absent, he occasionally slipped into old patterns, flirtations, affairs, brief indiscretions that likely meant little to him, but that struck at the core of Igea's pride. Igea, for her part, was hardly naive. She knew exactly who Luciano had been, and who, beneath the surface, he still was. But knowing it intellectually was one thing, witnessing it was another. There were scenes. One such incident unfolded at their favored haunt, the San Francisco Bar and Grill, which Luciano partly owned, a place that had become something of a safe haven for them both. On one particular evening, Igea entered unexpectedly, finding Luciano entertaining another woman at a corner table. Her entrance, though calm at first, soon took on a darker tone. Without raising her voice, she reached into her handbag and produced a small .22 caliber pistol. In front of Luciano and the astonished onlookers, she made her position abundantly clear. "If I ever see you even flirt with another girl," she told him, "you'll get this." Luciano, caught between public embarrassment and his own twisted version of affection, tried to de-escalate. He laughed it off, waved her hand down, and told her not to make a scene. But behind the humor lay real tension. Igea was no passive mole. Milanese, proud and fiercely self-possessed, she would not tolerate humiliation, not even from lucky Luciano. She was capable of great loyalty, but not unconditional submission. The volatility did not end there. On another occasion, as recounted by a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent who had grown friendly with Luciano while undercover, an even darker episode played out at a low-life club known as the Snake Pit. When Igea unexpectedly arrived, angry at Luciano's presence in such a disreputable place, a sharp argument ensued. This time, Luciano, perhaps emboldened by alcohol, perhaps by wounded pride, struck her. A public slap. The act was shocking even by the standards of mid-century gender dynamics, especially given Igea's background. Later, the agent recounted, Igea confided her rage and humiliation. "I am a civilized European woman, not a Sicilian," she said bitterly. "I am not accustomed to being slapped like a peasant girl." With ominous calm, she warned that if he ever struck her again in public, she would not hesitate to shoot him with the pistol she kept at their apartment, the very one she had brandished before. Their relationship then was a strange mixture of tenderness and violence, of deep emotional connection shadowed by Luciano's lingering instincts for dominance and Igea's fierce defense of her own dignity. It was not the sweeping romance of Hollywood fantasies, but rather something rawer, more complex. The collision of a powerful gangster's limited emotional vocabulary with a strong woman's unwillingness to surrender entirely. As years passed, their peculiar partnership continued, passionate, stormy, yet enduring. And in the streets of Naples, the spectacle of lucky Luciano's domestic life became, strangely, something of a tourist attraction. American sailors on shore leave sought his autograph, journalists hungered for interviews, even American entertainers stopped by to pay respects or simply out of curiosity. Luciano, always aware of his myth, played the role with sardonic grace. Among his regular visitors was Jimmy Durante, who once sent him a $250 check for undisclosed services. Frank Sinatra, too, visited Luciano during his Italian tours, though Luciano was tempted to tell Sinatra to return to his first wife rather than pursue Ava Gardner, advice, mercifully, he refrained from giving. Even Mario Lanza, the famed opera tenor, crossed paths with Luciano. When Lanza balked at performing at a charity event Luciano was organizing, underworld pressure allegedly fell upon him. Shortly thereafter, Lanza died suddenly under highly suspicious circumstances, fueling endless rumors, none of which, it must be said, were ever definitively proven. For a man supposedly banished from power, Luciano's gravitational pull remained strong. He was no longer running the American Mafia, but in the fog of rumor and myth, his legend grew larger than life. That Luciano allowed this myth to persist, and even enjoyed it, reveals much about his complicated vanity. As the 1950s progressed, the thin veneer of Luciano's domestic normalcy remained under constant scrutiny. much of it fueled not by any proven crime, but by the myth of who he once was. For both American and Italian authorities, the notion that Lucky Luciano had truly retired was simply unthinkable. Once a kingpin, always a kingpin, or so they reasoned. The Italian police kept Luciano under close surveillance, compiling thick dossiers full of conjecture, informant whispers, and outright speculation. They acknowledged that Luciano appeared to be living quietly, but remained convinced that darker activities lurked beneath the surface. Luciano spends more money than he appears to earn, one 1958 police report noted darkly, and he has contact with shady characters who go back and forth between Italy and the United States. On the American side, men like Harry Anslinger at the Federal Bureau of Narcotics clung to the belief that Luciano remained a puppet master directing international drug trafficking from the cafes of Naples. This belief was not always supported by evidence, but for bureaucrats and politicians, the narrative had its uses. It justified budgets, operations, and public hearings. Indeed, years after Luciano's exile, Anslinger thundered before Congress that Luciano still controlled vast heroin routes, buying opium from Turkey, refining it in Italy, and shipping it to the United States. That no concrete proof ever surfaced seemed to matter little. Privately, however, the reality was far less grand. Luciano's income from the American syndicates, once a torrent, was slowly drying up. His old allies facing their own legal troubles had less to send. The collapse of the Havana casino empire after Castro's rise in 1959 dealt a devastating financial blow. Luciano estimated that losing Cuba cost him a full quarter of his income. He toyed with small business ventures, including opening medical supply stores in Naples and dealing in legitimate imports, but these brought little stability. His dream of building parking garages on vacant lots never materialized. As always, it was Igea who buffered these disappointments. She managed their household with quiet dignity, adjusted to the changing circumstances, and refused to let financial concerns undermine the structure of their domestic life. Through it all, she remained his one constant, his partner, his companion, and increasingly his protector. While the world outside still saw Lucky Luciano the gangster inside their apartment on Via Tasso, Igea remained the firm, elegant presence who kept his world from collapsing completely. And yet, beneath this fragile normalcy, a darker shadow was beginning to gather, though neither of them yet fully grasped it. By the mid-1950s, Igea began experiencing spells of unexplained fatigue. At first, they thought little of it. She was still young, after all, in her mid-30s, and had carried the strain of years living under public scrutiny alongside a famously complicated man. She kept her discomfort largely to herself, not wishing to worry Luciano, who was already grappling with his own battles, both legal and existential. But the signs were there: periodic pains, a sense of heaviness, and subtle physical changes that would eventually prove far more ominous than either of them wished to imagine. For now, though, they carried on, visiting restaurants, hosting friends, strolling the Naples waterfront, enjoying the peace they had managed to build, even as the storm that would break both of them drew steadily closer. By 1957, the fortress Igea had built around Luciano, shielding him from scandals, financial anxieties, and the restless ghosts of his criminal past, was beginning to falter. But the threat did not come from the police or from rival mobsters. It came from within her own body. It began, as such things often do, with small, almost trivial signs: fatigue that wouldn't lift, discomfort that seemed minor, a few tender lumps in her left breast. She tried to dismiss it, perhaps even to hide it at first. After all, she had lived for years beside a man perpetually battling enemies both real and imagined. Her own minor ailments felt undeserving of attention by comparison. But eventually the symptoms became impossible to ignore. When she finally consented to a full medical examination, Luciano accompanied her to see their trusted physician in Naples, Professor Dottore Matteoli. The doctor's initial words were cautious, measured, carefully designed not to cause panic. The lumps, he suggested, were likely benign tumors. Nevertheless, he recommended exploratory surgery. For Luciano, the real fear was not just the physical danger, but Igaya's likely reaction to surgery itself. She was, after all, a dancer. Her body was her grace, her identity. The thought of disfigurement terrified her, and Luciano, perhaps more than anyone, understood why. She was so proud of her body, and she gave herself to me with such openness that it was like glue for us. I knew the first thing she would think about was that an operation might give her some kind of defect and turn me away. It was one of the rare moments in Luciano's life where his tough exterior gave way entirely to vulnerability. The man who had survived gang wars, betrayals, and prison now stood helpless before an invisible enemy that neither charm, money, nor violence could defeat. Ironically, fate played one of its cruelest tricks in those first few months. For a time after the initial diagnosis, Igaya's condition appeared to improve spontaneously. The lumps seemed to diminish. Her color returned. She grew energetic again, shopping for Christmas, laughing at dinner, even teasing Luciano about his ongoing feud with law enforcement. Luciano clung to this fragile hope. Perhaps the doctors were wrong. Perhaps, just perhaps, they had been spared. Dr. Mattioli, however, remained watchful. The apparent remission was medically suspicious. He urged continued monitoring, though for now postponed surgery. Luciano was relieved but privately remained on edge. As he would later put it, "This was some load off my mind, because just then I had plenty of troubles, but as long as Igea was well, there was only one problem that really ate into my guts: how to take care of my dear friend Don Vittone." Indeed, during these months, Luciano's feud with his old rival Vito Genovese still gnawed at him. But even that lifelong grudge temporarily receded into the background as his concerns for Igea grew. By early 1958, the reprieve was over. The pain returned, the lumps grew, and there was no more room for optimism. This time, Luciano insisted on being present in the examination room. There was no more pretending. As Dr. Mattioli palpated Igaya's breast, Luciano could see by the doctor's face that something was very wrong. "I think she has cancer," the doctor finally admitted. "It looks bad, and I'm sorry we waited so long." The words hit Luciano like a physical blow. His first question was simple: would she die? The answer was painfully uncertain. If they had caught it in time, she might live. If not, and the doctor feared they had not, then her odds were grim. Luciano was not a man easily frightened, but now, confronted with an enemy immune to his usual weapons, he panicked. There was only one order he could give: "I don't care what you got to do, just save her life." In the spring of 1958, Igea was admitted to the hospital for surgery. The tumor was worse than anticipated. The cancer had spread deeply, and her left breast was fully removed in an extensive mastectomy. Luciano spent the entire operation pacing the hospital corridor like a caged animal. Even his closest friends stayed away, understanding that in these hours he was unreachable. His public face, so carefully maintained all his life, collapsed completely. "I smoked one butt after another and prayed," he later remembered. "I promised God anything if only he would make her better." When the surgeon finally emerged, his report was cautiously hopeful. The operation had gone as well as possible. They had removed all visible cancer. For the first time in days, Luciano allowed himself to breathe. In the recovery room, as Igea lay pale and still beneath heavy bandages, Luciano sat beside her, his usual bravado utterly gone. As he watched her fragile figure sleeping, he realized something that had perhaps been growing in him for years, but which he had never fully articulated. I once said I didn't know what love is, but at that minute, it come to me that I knew all along. Love and Igea was the same thing for me. It was perhaps the most honest confession of his entire life. For several weeks after the operation, there was hope. Igea returned home, withdrawn and somber at first, but slowly began resuming the rhythms of their shared life. Friends sent flowers, well-wishers called. Even the press, long fixated on Luciano's notoriety, carried sympathetic headlines. Luciano, too, works tirelessly to reassure her. He lavished her with attention, gifts, and tenderness. To him, the disfigurement meant nothing. To her, it meant everything. But gradually, she began to smile again. It seemed for a moment that they had escaped the worst. The fragile reprieve they had enjoyed was, as it turned out, merely the eye of the storm. Only a few months after returning home, Igea woke one morning sobbing uncontrollably. Luciano rushed to her side, fearing the worst, and quickly saw why. On her right breast, several small, hard red lumps had appeared. She lowered the right side of her nightgown and pointed to her breast. Luciano later recalled, the pain still fresh even years after. There were several small but visible red lumps on it. For Igea, it was not only the physical terror, but the psychological horror of reliving the ordeal again, of another surgery, more disfigurement, and the looming spectre of death that neither of them dared name. Luciano wrapped his arms around her, promising, or perhaps pleading, that all that mattered was her survival, not her body. And yet, both of them knew the stakes had grown darker. Luciano moved quickly, bringing her back to Naples for immediate surgery. This time, the doctors were far less optimistic. The cancer had spread aggressively. Though they removed her right breast, they could not excise all the disease. What remained was already metastasizing through her body. When Dr. Matteoli met Luciano after surgery, his usual clinical reserve faltered. "Are you trying to tell me that Igea is going to die?" Luciano asked him directly. "Yes, Charlie. There's nothing more we can do." Luciano stood silent, absorbing the verdict like a man awaiting his own execution. The bravado, the power, the violence of his life, none of it mattered now. His entire existence narrowed to a single helpless truth. He could not save her. From that moment forward, every day became a battle not for survival, but for dignity. Luciano threw all his considerable resources into making her final months as painless as possible. Dr. Matteoli visited daily, administering increasingly heavy doses of morphine. Friends and family visited, though many left in tears, unable to bear the sight of the once radiant Igea now gaunt and weakened. And yet, even as the disease ravaged her body, her spirit remained startlingly lucid. Her greatest concern to the end was not herself, but Luciano. "All she ever wanted to think about was how I was going to make out after she died," Luciano recalled. "It was like a knife in me." In one conversation with Giovanni Passeggio, a police official who had long been sympathetic to Luciano, Igea begged that arrangements be made for Luciano to move north to Milan after her death, so he could be near her family. Passeggio gently assured her that anything she desired would be arranged, while inwardly hoping to stave off the inevitable for as long as possible. By September 1958, the cancer had fully consumed her. She slipped into a coma, her breathing shallow, her body skeletal. Luciano barely left her side. He sat hour after hour, refusing food, his face deeply lined, his famously sharp features sunken and hollow. The great gambler who once orchestrated empires now hovered beside a single hospital bed, unable to do anything but hold her hand. Her father, Giovanni Lissoni, flew to Naples and joined Luciano at her bedside. For these last days, the earlier years of family resentment and scandal seemed irrelevant, Now, they were simply two grieving men watching a woman they both loved slip away. Early in the morning of September 27th, Igea briefly regained consciousness. Her eyes flickered open and she saw Luciano and her father. With great effort, she whispered two words, "Caro mio." Then she slipped back into unconsciousness and within the hour passed away. She was 37 years old. Luciano personally arranged for Igea's body to be transported to Milan for burial in the family plot at the Cimitero di Musocco. The obituary, printed in Corriere della Sera, was brief, dignified, and quietly heartbreaking. She was listed as solaced by religious comfort after a trying illness, her soul given to God. On the day of the funeral, October 1st, 1958, the Italian authorities lifted Luciano's travel restrictions so that he could attend. He followed the hearse on foot beneath the dreary Milanese rain, dressed in a grey suit, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of grief. Igea lay in her coffin atop a bed of roses, wearing her gold wedding band, with a silk sash embroidered with a single word across her chest, Charlie. After the final prayers, as the mourners departed, Luciano remained by the graveside, his glasses misted by rain, staring down into the earth long after the coffin was covered. The gravediggers, unsure whether to interrupt, eventually retreated to let him grieve alone. When Luciano returned to Naples, the Via Tasso penthouse felt unrecognizable. The housekeeper Lydia still bustled quietly in the background. The two little dogs, confused by the absence of their mistress, darted from room to room, as if searching for her. Igea's belongings were packed and given to her sister Daria, save for a mountain of photographs that Luciano kept, along with his memories. He wore black for weeks, as tradition dictated. Friends noted that he became withdrawn, irritable and hollow-eyed. The man who once commanded an empire now seemed incapable of commanding even himself. In the months following Igea's death, Luciano existed in a kind of suspended animation. The house still stood, the routines remained, but the energy that had once filled the apartment vanished completely. Naples, once lively under Igea's hand, now became little more than a gloomy exile. The penthouse was silent except for the low sounds of the dogs, Bambi and his companion, who remained faithful companions in their mistress's absence. Luciano's health began to decline rapidly. He was no longer the man who had once outwitted prosecutors, betrayed bosses, and manipulated entire syndicates. Without Igea's careful stewardship, Luciano drifted, emotionally, physically and financially. Old age had finally caught up with the man who had defied it for so long. By early 1959, another woman entered Luciano's life, Adriana Rizzo, a 23-year-old Neapolitan shopgirl. Luciano had known her casually for several years. She worked at a medical supply store where he had purchased back supports for his chronic spinal issues. Now, in the absence of Igea, Adriana became a frequent visitor to his table at the Santa Lucia restaurant. One afternoon, as she walked past his outdoor table, Luciano, ever the old-world flirt, reached out and playfully pinched her. "I didn't mean nothing nasty by it," he would later explain. "With Italian girls, it's kind of a compliment." What began as casual flirtation quickly evolved into something more practical. Adriana had some light nursing training, and Luciano, increasingly frail, increasingly lonely, offered her a proposition: move into the penthouse and help care for him. Adriana accepted. The arrangement suited both. She was attentive, pleasant, and offered companionship without the emotional demands that Igea's presence had once brought. Luciano, for his part, was honest with her from the start. There would be no marriage, no elaborate charades, just comfort, companionship, and financial security. Adriana's family, practical Neapolitans, raised no objections. Her father, a taxi driver, accepted the arrangement pragmatically, particularly as Luciano occasionally assisted them financially. Luciano's physical decline accelerated. Within months of Adriana moving in, he suffered his first heart attack. Though relatively mild, the scare prompted his doctors, Professore Matteoli and a new cardiologist, Dr. Di Martine, to deliver stern warnings. If Luciano didn't slow down, the next attack could easily be fatal. "They told me to slow down," Luciano later recounted. "That scared the shit out of me." Adriana proved capable of enforcing the doctor's orders with remarkable discipline. She regulated his diet, limited his movement, and even physically blocked his attempts to resume sexual relations. At one point, she whacked him over the head when he pushed his luck, leaving a lump that both laughed about later. Despite her youth, Adriana managed what few others could. She controlled Lucky Luciano, or at least, what was left of him. The Lucky Luciano of the late 1950s was no longer the kingmaker of the underworld. His power had diminished not because of police raids or betrayals, but because time itself had quietly stripped him of relevance. In his prime, Luciano would have easily handled threats from old allies and enemies in America. But now, with most of his peers either imprisoned or deceased, he was increasingly isolated. The Mafia had moved on without him. His old friend Joe Adonis, who had once been a fierce enforcer in Luciano's empire, had accepted deportation to Milan. While Luciano struggled financially, Adonis lived lavishly, untouched by debt, dining in Milanese palazzos and enjoying his wealth freely. Occasionally, Adonis would meet Luciano in Naples, but their friendship cooled quickly. Adonis offered no help. The power dynamics between them had reversed. Luciano's world had grown smaller and he was painfully aware of it. As his health declined, Luciano became increasingly preoccupied with his own legacy. In America, his criminal contemporaries, Capone, Lepke, Legs Diamond, were being immortalized in movies and books. Luciano, too, wanted his version told. He toyed with the idea of financing his own film as early as 1952, even contacting producers. By 1959, he was working with a film producer named Barnett Glassman. Luciano drafted his own script, a rather sanitized version in which he was framed by corrupt prosecutors and lived peacefully as a charitable exile in Italy. Glassman politely suggested hiring a professional screenwriter. Luciano reluctantly agreed. Later, another figure entered the picture, Martin Gosch, an aspiring producer eager to capitalize on Luciano's notoriety. Gosch ingratiated himself into Luciano's circle and for a time worked closely with him on the script. Yet Luciano never fully trusted him. "You couldn't get 20 words out of Charlie unless he really trusted you," Glassman recalled, and he didn't care much for Gosch. As the years wore on, the project remained stalled. Luciano's health left him with diminishing energy to deal with producers, scripts, and negotiations. The film, like so many of his late ventures, withered before reaching fruition. Even as his health weakened and his influence diminished, Luciano's shadow still loomed large in the minds of American law enforcement, particularly within the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. To them, Lucky Luciano remained the puppet master behind every international heroin shipment, regardless of whether any real evidence existed to support such claims. Enter Salvizini, a Sicilian-born FBN agent posing as Major Mike Serra of the U.S. Air Force. Vizzini ingratiated himself with Luciano undercover, hoping to catch him coordinating the global drug trade that Anslinger and others insisted still operated under his command. What Vizzini found, however, was not an international kingpin orchestrating complex operations, but a lonely, aging man largely living off old money and diminishing contacts. Luciano's income was, by now, mostly a trickle, occasional funds sent by his remaining friends in the US, increasingly pinched as their own troubles mounted. His once grand empire of vice had become little more than rumor, a ghost kingdom propped up more by bureaucratic imagination than actual commerce. Still, Vizzini's reports to his superiors were predictably breathless. He described Luciano's tentacles as far-reaching, insisted the old mobster was still receiving large cash shipments, and accused him of orchestrating narcotics flows between Turkey, Marseille, and New York. The FBN eagerly swallowed the fantasy, because the myth of Lucky Luciano was simply too valuable to retire. Luciano himself, perhaps amused, perhaps weary, played his role carefully. He allowed Vizzini into his confidence, up to a point. They drank, visited racetracks, and shared long conversations, but Luciano offered little of substance. "Just 6 months. That's all I want," Luciano once confided to Vizzini. 3 months in New York, 3 months in Miami. Then they could bury me. It was a wistful, haunting admission. Not a criminal scheme, but a dying man's simple wish to walk again on American streets before death claimed him. As 1961 approached, Luciano's relationship with Martin Gosch, the would-be film producer, soured badly. While the script they had worked on together was completed and even signed off by Luciano, behind the scenes, the American underworld stirred nervously. Rumors swirled that New York bosses feared the film would reveal secrets better left buried, even if indirectly. Thomas Eberly, acting on behalf of imprisoned mob boss Vito Genovese, allegedly warned Luciano that the film project was unacceptable. According to some accounts, Luciano was informed that if the movie moved forward, he could consider himself a dead man. Luciano took the threat seriously. The syndicate may have abandoned him financially, but their reach remained lethal. Gosch's version of events suggests that Luciano reluctantly agreed to abandon the film project and surrender the signed script to the New York bosses, a desperate trade to secure his own safety. The truth of these negotiations remains murky, but one fact is certain: the film was never made. Still, he scheduled a meeting with Martin Gosch at Capodichino Airport in Naples, allegedly to finalize matters surrounding the cursed movie project, once and for all. He was dressed smartly: grey flannel slacks, navy blazer, white open-collar shirt, striped blue tie loosened at the neck, looking very much the retired dignitary rather than the aging mobster. With him was an Italian police officer, still monitoring his every move. At approximately 4 p.m. on January 26, 1962, the aircraft carrying Gosch arrived. Luciano greeted him calmly. As they exited the terminal together, preparing to walk toward Luciano's car, something inside him gave way. Suddenly, Luciano stumbled, his body twisting slightly as he clutched Gosch's arm. "Charlie, what's wrong with you?" Gosch asked in alarm. Luciano said nothing. He simply slumped to the ground. His heart, which had carried him through decades of violence, betrayals, and survival, finally gave out. An airport doctor rushed to the scene, but could only shake his head. Luciano was dead. The time of death was recorded as 5:25 p.m. He was 64 years old. For several hours, Luciano's body lay under a green canvas sheet on the cold cement of the Naples airport parking lot, his face partially exposed to the winter sky. "Once I said I'd end up on a cement slab," Luciano had remarked years earlier. In one final bitter irony, the great master of organized crime, who had once ruled New York, restructured the American Mafia, and defied governments, now lay under an impromptu makeshift cover, awaiting transfer to the Naples morgue. For decades, Lucky Luciano had lived as an exile, first banished from the United States, then exiled from Rome, and finally a fading legend wandering the streets of Naples. And yet, in death, he finally returned to the country that had long disowned him. His body was prepared for shipment to New York, where the underworld, with the quiet efficiency of an organization that still recognized its fallen architect, made discreet arrangements for his burial. In a quiet corner of St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, Luciano was laid to rest near his parents and brother. The grave marker reads simply, Charles Luciano, 1897 to 1962. The man who had built the modern Mafia died as he had lived, both larger than life and painfully small beneath the cold stone. But for all the men who came, the old associates, the distant relatives, the curious journalists peering from the perimeter, one face was absent. Igaya's. She lay across the ocean in Milan, buried in the family plot at the Cimitero di Musocco, beneath a bed of roses Luciano had once chosen for her. Her gold wedding band, which she had worn in life despite never legally marrying him, still adorned her finger. On her chest, even in death, had been placed that final silk sash embroidered with the name Charlie, a quiet testament to their strange, tender and turbulent decade together. Though Luciano lived nearly 4 years after Igaya's death, by every account, he was never truly whole again. Adriana Rizzo may have filled the empty rooms of Via Tasso and helped prolong his fragile life, but she never replaced Igea. In quieter moments, Luciano was known to gaze at the portrait of Igea hanging on his apartment wall. That painting, of the elegant Milanese woman who had once walked into a nightclub in Rome and changed his life, remained his silent companion until the day he died. "She was my whole life," he told Martin Gosch during one of their last meetings. "No girl I ever knew could compare with Igea." He had ruled empires, sent men to their deaths, manipulated governments, and brokered deals with killers. But in his final years, all of that seemed to recede beneath the shadow of a single devastating loss. The loss of the only person who had ever asked nothing of him but love. The rare woman who neither feared nor idolized him, but loved him for reasons she herself described with quiet clarity. That you were an American gangster, or perhaps that you were in trouble with the police, had nothing to do with it. It is merely that I discovered what every woman must have. You love me, and you need me. In her love, there was neither naivety nor delusion, only a sober acknowledgement of their reality and a courageous choice to live within it. Perhaps the greatest irony of Luciano's long and violent life is that after all the betrayals, murders, and crimes, his greatest heartbreak came not at the hands of his enemies, but through something he could neither control nor defeat. Cancer stealing away the only woman who ever truly tamed him. The government never truly caught him. The rival bosses never successfully silenced him. But time and disease accomplished what law and vengeance never could. They stripped Luciano of the only thing he could never replace. In the end, the world remembered him as a kingpin. But Luciano himself, in his most private confessions, remembered himself simply as Igaya's Charlie.